down to your teeth, people.
Who doesn't love a good railgun? There's something pretty awe-inspiring about throwing a metal slug at 8 times the speed of sound. It's potent technology, something that used to be limited to science fiction, but railguns are now starting to see testing on Navy ships. The next logical step is to put it on a tank, right? Couldn't that revolutionize tank warfare on the same level as ATGMs and Sabo rounds? It could, but there's still a lot of work to be done. For this video I thought I'd talk about some of the pros and cons of railguns, and what needs to happen before they can become a practical tank weapon. Now let's get into it. One of the biggest pros for railguns is safety. In tank design, there are a lot of considerations and design compromises that need to be taken because of the volatility of your tank's own ammunition. Ammunition fires and explosions are among the leading killers of tanks on the battlefield. With railguns, you don't have to worry about that. The only thing launching the projectile is electromagnetism, no chemical propellant involved. That means that you don't have to worry about where the safest place to keep the ammo is, or if it needs blowout panels. This ties into the next pro. Since the projectiles don't have propellant casings, it makes them much smaller and cheaper. The diameter of the round would likely be much smaller than that on current tanks, leading to a further decrease in size, and therefore, a very large increase in the amount of ammunition that you can carry. That's a big plus for mission endurance and logistics. On ships, it's expected that railguns will double the available ammunition capacity. It's also reasonable to assume that, if you can reduce the size of the projectile and the gun, that you can reduce the profile of the turret as well. The majority of the railgun's electrical components could be placed in the hull. If you combine this with an unmanned turret, you could have an IFV-sized turret that delivers damage like a main battle tank. A smaller turret means not only a smaller profile, but more armor that you can give that turret for the same amount of weight. From a hull-down position, this type of setup would be particularly devastating. The final significant pro for a tank-mounted railgun is the massive increase in effective range. Higher velocity means the projectile can go farther before its penetrative capability decreases, and it eventually stops. But the time of flight reduction should not be ignored. This would be particularly helpful against airborne targets. Imagine a programmable railgun round which could detonate itself while in close proximity to an airborne target, releasing a cloud of flechettes. Unfortunately, like every other piece of military equipment out there, railguns also have downsides. For example, sometimes railgun ammo can vaporize while being accelerated. This depends on the velocity and the material used, but materials behave strangely while at hypervelocity. If it isn't vaporized, it could potentially become unstabilized, resulting in a loss of accuracy and lethality. Next, railguns have a pretty short lifespan. The forces at work are incredibly immense. An insane amount of pressure is needed just to keep the rails from forcing themselves apart. Previously, railguns could only fire tens of rounds before the barrel wore out. Currently, they're up to being able to fire hundreds of rounds. The goal is to be able to fire thousands of rounds before needing to replace the barrel. This is more of an issue than it is with regular tank barrels because railgun barrels are obviously much more expensive than conventional cannon barrels. It would also be difficult to maintain a high rate of fire with a railgun without destroying the power supply. The maximum rate of fire is currently acceptable for naval guns and main battle tanks, but becomes troublesome if you want an IFV with a railgun. The final con is that, currently, all the electrical systems needed for a functional railgun are too large to fit in a tank. With a ship, it's not much of a problem. There's a ton of space and a very large amount of available power. Tanks are obviously much more compact and don't have a ton of power. Of course, in time, the technology required will scale down to a point where it could fit into a tank. Things like solid-state batteries and fuel cells will help that process along. So it's not really a matter of if railguns will be mounted in tanks, just a matter of when. If I had to guess, I think in around 20 years or so, you'll start to see the large-scale deployment of tanks armed with railguns. And that about wraps it up. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video.